Leading up to the release of Valhalla, I was so excited with everything Ubi said about combat. It was going to be brutal, crunchy, weighty. You're going to feel the weight of the Viking experience, what it was like to raid monasteries. And I was expecting it to feel more grounded. These were things that I felt were missing from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And for the most part, I do think that Valhalla is a lot of those things. But after, I would say, several dozen hours, like 30 hours, I started noticing a few things that I didn't love about Valhalla's combat. And I've really been back and forth ever since. I mean, sometimes it feels great, sometimes it feels not so great. So I figured I'd share my thoughts on Valhalla's combat and see what you guys think. Before we jump in, just know that this is a constructive video. I am not here to tell you that Valhalla has the worst combat known to mankind. There's plenty of other videos, I'm sure, already that exist telling you something like that. You have to really love something to be critical enough to want it to be better. And so that is the angle that I'm approaching this from. I really do like the combat in Valhalla. I just think it could be better. Let's start out with some positives. Some stuff I really do like about this combat. I think it's genuinely fun, and there's some really flashy and well-made animations that are satisfying when you're able to pull them off, when you're able to get into a rhythm. It's so satisfying to pull off those parries and dodges and land hits when you know you've bested your enemy, and that general combat loop, the sort of hitbox style that they switched to when they rebooted the franchise, that still feels great. Dual wielding is an area that mostly lives up to expectations for me. I think it's so cool, the amount of combinations and options that you have. There's so many different weapon types, and then the fact that you can slot them in different slots. And really, when you start tallying up how many different ways you can utilize this system, it's really impressive and it holds up. But there's also some small little things that I really enjoy, some specific skills within the tree. And my favorite one, it has to be missile reversal. It is so satisfying to click the parry button at just the right time when an arrow lands, and then catch that arrow and shoot it right back at your enemy. I wish there was more of that stuff going on. Another area I've really enjoyed is runes, and I usually don't like that stuff. I don't like those micro little differences that you can make, like plus 1% damage to this specific kind of attack. It never feels like it's making enough of a difference, but it does in Valhalla, especially as you level up and you get some of those really interesting runes that fundamentally change the way that a piece of armor or weapon works. The weak point system, I think, is one of the best additions to Valhalla. It adds a bit of skill to the ranged combat. You're not just aiming for the head, right? You're trying to hit those weak points, build up stun, and then that unlocks a stun attack that really deals a ton of damage. Enemy variety is also interesting. When I enter new regions, like for example, the Picts in the north in Jorvikshire, when I first faced them, their combat style is so different than any other enemy type, and it really kind of added a skill curve for me. It added something that I had to learn when I was already dozens and dozens of hours into the game, which is something I always appreciate when a game is able to do that. And then I've also really liked the one-on-one fights with zealots, special enemy types, world bosses, stuff like that. Those encounters, for the most part, I think are really well designed. There's some very interesting, unique enemy behaviors that just threw me for a loop. I was like, oh my gosh, this is really unique and cool and fun. And I appreciate, once again, when a game does do that for me, when it's not just like a souped up version of another kind of enemy type you've already been facing. Now we're gonna get into the criticism. And for me, there's just some issues at the core of Valhalla's combat design in general that have been bugging me to the point where I think it's worth talking about. And the main issue for me is flow. I don't think that Valhalla's combat flows as well as it could. And for me, if there's any sort of flow or rhythm with combat that I get into, finishers. Finishers come in and just break that rhythm completely. And let me clarify, I'm talking about, for the most part, these automatic finishers. So this is when you kill an enemy, you've gotten their health bar all the way down, and you land that killing blow, and you are automatically sucked into an animation. Something that takes anywhere from a second and a half to it feels like 3 to 4 to 5 seconds. To me, this feels like the cardinal sin of AC Valhalla's combat. It's the ones that are not activated. And we've had cinematic finishers that randomly sort of happen in the series before, Assassin's Creed 3 had some really cool ones with Connor that sort of had this swinging camera that would kind of get you right in the action, and it felt really satisfying. Like, I liked those. And so did Revelations. Revelations had some fun sort of cinematic finishers, but those didn't really bother me like they do here. Now, I think these finishers are a fine concept. It does feel brutal. I mean, seeing heads lopped off and limbs chopped off, it's appropriate for a Viking era AC game, but they just happen way too often. And I think this is something that would work in a game with a tight, like, I don't know, 20 to 30 hour campaign, right? Not something that you are sinking over 100 hours in. I think it's a flow issue, but also like a volume issue. It's something that you see just way too often. And I think the solution, if we're going to come up with one, is to see these finishers only at the end of combat encounters. Like, I've fought a group of 10 guys. The very last guy that I kill in that group, I get a cool combat finisher. You know, I'm not having situations where I'm killing a Goliath and then choking him to death and then screaming. That's really cool the first, I think, dozen times I saw it. But after that, it just got old for me. So I'd like an option to just turn those off. I don't want to see the automatic combat finishers. So now that we got those out of the way, let's talk about normal stun finishers. These are ones that are player activated, that on a controller you press the right stick to activate. These are stomping, these are the bow stun finisher, and also just the melee stun finisher. These as well, even though they are player activated, they break up the flow of combat. But for me, they can be avoided, which is nice because you don't have to press that button, right? And I've found that personally, when I play the game, I am avoiding using these, which is not great, but the reason is partly the animation. I don't want to sit through a 1 to 3 second animation. For some reason, there are 3 different actions mapped to the right stick if you're playing on a controller. You've got Explosive Corpse, you've got Stomp, you've got Stun Finisher, and you've also got the Combat Lock, which, as you guys know, this lets you lock onto a target. So the problem is I'm trying to do one of these actions and there's multiple enemies that might be on the ground, but at the same time, there are some that are dead, but also there are some that are alive in the background. So what does that mean? In any given situation, I am frequently pressing the right stick and not getting the result that I want. I have Eivor trying to set an explosive trap. I have Eivor locking onto an enemy when I want to stomp. But I'm also trying to use Odin's Sight to mark enemies around me in a chaotic like assault or a large-scale battle. This is a consistent issue for me to the point where I uncheck those skills. Like, I don't want Explosive Corpse. I don't want Stomp. I don't want... Bow Stun Finisher is really cool. I like that one. But generally speaking, you can get around this. You can deal with this by unchecking those skill nodes. But man, this feels like something that should have been addressed. So clearly my big beef with Valhalla's combat is finishers and just the concept of it. But I also have an issue with how buggy they are. And this is not a constant thing because there are certain situations where you're behind an enemy, for example, and you activate a stun finisher and Eivor appears right behind them and does a really cool animation, and it flows really well. But a lot of the time, when they're initiated, they break animations in order to place enemies in positions for these to work. And this is not just an every now and then thing. I mean, pretty much every single fight that I'm in, I notice this happening at least once. Because once again, finishers are so common. The fact that you're seeing these auto finishers so often, the fact that there are so many skills that activate the finishers, and because they tend to be buggy, it just adds a general sloppiness to combat. Combat doesn't feel as clean as I think it should. Just a few things I think worth mentioning. Going into this game, people were worried about abilities because in Odyssey, they look to be a little too magical and not grounded enough. And when we had early footage and when I played the game earlier, sometimes they look too ridiculous, right? Or over the top, like Kick of Tyr would launch people 20 feet away. I've felt generally that this doesn't bother me. They feel grounded and they fit in with the rest of what Valhalla is doing with combat. I don't feel magical, and they generally serve a purpose, but they're also buggy. This may be something just with my playstyle, but I've mostly defaulted to Viking Harpoon and Kick of Tyr. Those seem to be two of the most useful abilities in this game. But the problem is these attacks fling enemies all over the place. Like, it flings them on the ground, into each other, And in general, it causes animations to break. Like I'll fling one guy into another and that guy will just fall to the ground and die on the spot. Like the physics don't fire properly. Because a lot of the abilities work like this, you have things like Dive of the Valkyrie that launches enemies into the air and knocks them over. It causes animations to break. And the general feeling is that it's a little clumsy. Outside of abilities too, something about Valhalla's combat does not feel responsive to me. A lot of the times I feel like I'm pressing buttons or taking actions or queuing up melee attacks, and it feels like the game is just catching up to me. It's playing catch up. It's not responding immediately after I press that button. And the result is that everything I do is about a half second too slow. Enemy AI is not as good as I think it could be. Too often I see enemies standing around, kind of waiting for me to attack. And it's a little weird because they see me, they're engaged in combat, but they're kind of just standing there. And it feels like it's a problem where they're disengaging and re-engaging from combat. And I don't know what the issue is there, if that could be fixed up with a patch, but too often do I notice that enemies are waiting for me to come up and hit them. Now, I'm not a game developer. I'm just a guy who shares opinions about video games. I don't know the first thing about how to address some of these things, but it does feel like since Origins, since the reboot, combat has been in a place where it's a little too loose and janky for me. It's not clean. What I'm driving at here is not that the combat needs to return to how it was before. I think there's a happy medium. There genuinely is. But the looseness and the uncleanness and not responsiveness of this current system feels core to the current version of Anvil, whatever engine they're using right now. So I'm hoping that whatever comes next does address this and makes Valhalla feel more like an action game, more responsive like an action game, and less like, you know, an RPG that may not have as good combat. So after all of that, you may be wondering, like, do you really enjoy this? You just spent all that time complaining. These are nitpicks, I do think, in an otherwise fun combat system. Like, it's fun to pick up and play and go on a raid in Valhalla. Like, it is really fun to me. The dodge, parry, hitbox system is satisfying to me. And I've found that the most fun that I have is fun that I make for myself with the weapon variety. I mean, dual flails is ridiculous and fun. Dual daggers feels super unique, unlike any other weapon combination in the game. But my trusty hammer and shield is where I've spent the most time in the game. But then again, I'll go to a single greatsword, and that feels very weighty and slow. And when I, make that contact, I feel powerful. After 90 or so hours of gameplay, it does feel like combat is a little bit lower on like my tier of things that I like about this game. So guys, I'm getting close to finishing the game, so I'll finally have those like story-focused analysis videos and be able to break down, the assassin-y stuff that I really play these games for. And I'll be able to like rank the game within the series. These are ideas that I've had on the back burner forever, but I just need to finish the game. So I'm getting really close to that point. So if you haven't already and you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to turn on live notifications so you don't miss those videos. Also make sure to follow me on social media. I'm at jayvee on YT on Twitter and at jayvee.yt on Instagram. And if you want to talk Assassin's Creed and other open world games like it, join our community Discord server, discord.gg/jayvee on YT. All of the links for everything I just talked about are in the description below. Big thanks to my YouTube members, my Ultra fans, Grass, Dave, Deadwalker, Bill, Cam, Cullen, and Jacob. Super fans, Kamal, Casey, Tipsy Sergey, Dan, Karen, and Tarl K. Fans, Matthew, Spyro, JVO, John, Lil Man, Brock, Tia, Level 42, Ryan, Allura, Ryan, Moonman, Joe, and Abhishek. And my supporters, Nos, Flame, Nightmare, Sung, V-Toxic, Taryn, Glenn, Elo Games, Undersittable, Adam, Blaze, Mr. Hollow, Quickness, and Furkin for supporting the channel. If you want to support me further, click the join button below this video. In exchange for your support, you'll unlock custom badges and emotes to use in chat. Check the link in the description for more information. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.